Canada has changed dramatically from the peaceable kingdom it was when I came here 53 years ago. I submit that it hasn't necessarily changed for the better. The first of the metamorphoses began soon after I landed. Lester B. Pearson, not the airport yet, only the Minister of External Affairs, was in charge when Canada decided to stake out a middle ground in its global position. Somehow, I don't know how, we took it into our heads that to exercise moral leadership in the world, we must observe strict neutrality between good and evil. And once we adopted that principle, there was no looking back. If fence sitting had been an Olympic sport, Canada would have brought home the gold. While we didn't exactly quit NATO, we tried to be history's first non-aligned member of a military alliance. We were resolved to be better than fair, which is like bending over backwards to be straighter than vertical. And by the last years of the Cold War, we had bent over backwards far enough to twist ourselves into a moral pretzel. To offer just one example, we became the sole supplier of nuclear reactors to Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu. For those who are too young to remember Ceausescu, he was East Europe's answer to Iran's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Not much of an answer, admittedly, but an answer before the question was even asked. Once Canada, the honest broker, was there, could multicultural Canada be far behind? We rejected the American melting pot. Too monolithic, we said. Even a cultural mosaic was too Anglo-Celtic, Franco-centric, insufficiently chaotic, too much set in stone. Integration sounded like an imperialist plot. We became suspicious of it, forgetting that the opposite of integration is disintegration. Some say we wrote the book on multiculturalism. We certainly wrote a philosophical treatise called The Nation as Grand Central Station, a retrospective entitled From Mosaic to Mess, a how-to book on rearview mirror driving called Watch Where You Came From, Not Where You Are Going, and a horticultural pamphlet called The Triumph of Roots Over Fruits. Hugh MacLennan's Two Solitudes was all very well in its day, but why make do with two when we could become the land of 1,000 solitudes? Having convinced ourselves that an inclusive Canada is best achieved by perpetuating exclusive ethnic enclaves, we all but switched from naturalizing immigrants to denaturalizing native-born Canadians. We made it fashionable for dual or multi-passport citizens to think of themselves in terms of cultures their forefathers left behind, and express it by wearing the apparel of countries whose languages they no longer understood. The origin of Canada, the land of identity politics, dates back to the mid-1960s. It came about through a bizarre twist in the Liberal position. Instead of seeking equality for individuals, we began seeking parity for groups. First by slow degrees, then more and more rapidly, we revised or abandoned the classical ideals of liberalism. We no longer demanded equal opportunity for people regardless of race, sex, ethnicity, or religion, but guaranteed results for communities designated as disadvantaged or distinct. We no longer asked for a fair chance for ourselves, but for a free or subsidized ride for one group. This trend was present in other Western countries, but in Canada, it all but acquired the status of a state religion. Progressive ideologues and demagogues, inside government as well as outside, encouraged us to demand benefits for our own ethnic or gender group and penalties for all other groups. They persuaded us that we were entitled to such benefits because we had suffered historic wrongs. The claim of disadvantage, accurate or inaccurate, trumped all notions of fairness and common sense. Now, some claims of historic wrongs were accurate because the world was never perfect. While Canada was better than most places, it did have threads of injustice running through its social fabric. The task would have been to pull them out without unraveling the entire garment. But while traditional liberals proposed to remedy injustice with justice, post-60s liberals tried to remedy it with reverse or affirmative injustice. Whatever the disease had done, The cure sent Canadians into orgies of hyphenation, replacing pride in our shared citizenship with pride in our separate identities. Going way beyond ethnicity or religion, identity politics encouraged, even compelled, everyone to become gay or straight, female or male, even driver or bicyclist first, and Canadian second, if at all. If Canada is still superior to most countries in the world, I submit it isn't because of what our socio-political establishment has been doing in the last 50 years, but in spite of it. Canada remains a good country mainly because of an enormous reservoir of equity and fairness in the traditions of an older Canada, the Canada of Anglo-Saxon justice, the Protestant work ethic, and Judeo-Christian values, combined with old world traditions of hard work, pride, and decency from immigrant cultures, in addition to the natural resources of an immense and wealthy land, and the market opportunities and military protection provided by an often maligned American neighbor. What will the coming decades bring? It depends on whether we will let classical liberal values shape our governments or let post-liberal governments shape our values. When it came to light many years ago that the RCMP illegally burned down some barns belonging to Quebec separatists, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau shrugged and said, "Oh well, if people are so upset by the Mounties burning barns illegally, perhaps he'll make it legal for Mounties to burn barns." Trudeau's remark of statist humor inadvertently touched on the heart of the matter. Canada's future will be dim unless we elect leaders and appoint judges who understand that it isn't wrong to burn barns because it's illegal, but it's illegal to burn barns because it's wrong. But in fact, democracy does not mean peace, freedom, and the rest. It simply denotes a system in which governments succeed each other by being elected, usually for a fixed term, by a majority of qualified voters. That's all. Rule by majority mandate says nothing in itself about what kind of rule it's going to be. That will depend on a society's other traditions and institutions. Without a free press, say, or a writ of habeas corpus, majority rule could amount to outright tyranny. The ancient city-state of Syracuse used to be ruled by an elected official called a tyrant. As a method of succession, a mandate by a majority of qualified voters is preferable to royal descent, divine revelation, popular or palace revolutions, or a military coup, South American style. A mandate, however, doesn't remotely assure peace, order, liberty, equality, prosperity, or justice. Peace and justice are more likely to result in universal suffrage than to be caused by it. The Magna Carta secured liberty much more than the vote. The unelected kings of England were obliged to rule far more democratically than the elected tyrants of ancient Greece. Desirable as democracy may be, all that can be imposed on a society from the outside is its letter. And democracy's letter may not spell the words we take to be democracy's spirit. In South America today, for instance, democracy may be spelled H-U-G-O-C-H-A-V-E-Z. Victorious democracies may pressure defeated autocracies to adopt majority rule as a method of governmental succession, but Iraqi or Honduran or Afghan majorities will not necessarily choose what we would like them to, or what would be good for them in the long run. Democracy isn't for sissies. You must remember, a kiss is just a kiss, but it's democracy that gave the world Hitler in 1933 and Hamas in 2006. Before exporting democracy, the West should try it at home. I apologize for the wisecrack, but like many glib statements, it carries more than a grain of truth. The world has had a one-night stand with freedom. She came in the late 19th century and went in the early 20th. During that brief period of laissez-faire capitalism, there was a measure of genuine liberty, and not only in the Wild West. In some ways, even the subjects of semi-constitutional monarchies, such as Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, were freer in the pre-World War I era than the income and consumption taxed inhabitants of the European Union are today. They were certainly freer in terms of individual expression, enterprise, and mobility than the photo-ID'd, hate crime-muzzled, gun-registered, license-regulated, smoke-freed, and body-searched citizens of the interventionist democracies are in our times, Canada's included. Freedom is not a zero-sum game. Your freedom does not diminish mine. What your freedom may curtail is my ambition. Say, your freedom to hire whomever you like may curtail my ambition to work for you. That's too bad, but it's your loss, not mine. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Enter the Human Rights Commissions. I opposed human rights commissions 32 years ago. The Federal Human Rights Commission was set up in 1977. I opposed them for two reasons. First, I believe these tribunals confused human rights with human ambitions. My decision whom to hire or who to work for is a human right. Making up my mind who should hire me or work for me isn't. It's a human ambition, laudable as it may be. A right may not be laudable, but it still trumps an ambition, or ought to in a free society. Anomalously, human rights commissions were proposing to champion human ambitions against human rights. The threat of human rights commissions to freedom of expression was even more daunting. I believed any state bureaucracy that could allow someone writing "help wanted mail" on the basis that it was an intent to discriminate could outlaw anybody writing anything, and would sooner or later. Human rights commissions would become Canada's Orwellian thought police. Balderdash, said the 1970s-style thinkers of Trudopia. No way. An old friend who promoted human rights commissions in those days, the Civil Liberties Association's General Counsel, Alan Borovoy, dismissed what he considered my shop-worn arguments of the slippery slope. Well, my arguments may have been shop-worn, but the slopes were slippery. By 1998, Borovoy had changed his mind. Quote, ever since the government embarked on a course of trying to outlaw expressions of hatred, it's shown that there is a slippery slope. One thing has led to another, he said in relation to a proposed hate speech legislation being considered in British Columbia. Unfortunately, by 1998, we had run out of slope. Canada was no longer a free country. Oh, it was free enough compared to, say, North Korea or even Singapore, but it wasn't free relative to itself, which is the only real criterion. Constitutions protect freedom, not fairness, liberty, not discernment. The human right that a free country protects, or ought to protect, is an individual's right to discriminate. That is, to freely choose his or her words, ideas, or associations. For the authorities to prescribe or prescribe discriminatory conduct is or ought to be a human rights violation. Let me repeat this. The right is to discriminate on any ground. The violation is to forbid or compel discrimination. As I said earlier, human rights commissions protect human rights violations against human rights. Freedom is the only human right. The rest, to be housed, hired, admitted to a club, are human ambitions. In the Ponzi scheme of human rights, the state feeds A's ambition by trading some of B's freedom for it, and then pays for C's ambition in the coin of A's freedom, until the gold of freedom is exchanged for the inflationary paper of ambitions and privileges, renamed rights, printed and doled out by the authorities.